What if I told you that 500 years ago, there existed a civilization so advanced that it would make modern urban planners weep with envy? An empire that built floating gardens that could feed millions, performed brain surgery with obsidian blades sharper than today's scalpels, and created a capital city that European visitors described as more magnificent than Paris or Rome. The Aztec Empire wasn't just another ancient civilization. It was a revolutionary society that challenged everything. We think we know about pre-Columbian America. But here's the twist that history books often skip. Their downfall wasn't just about Spanish conquistadors with guns and horses. The real story involves 5 shocking truths that reveal how an empire spanning millions of people could vanish in just 2 years. Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of the Aztecs, and I guarantee that by the end of this video, you'll never look at American history the same way again. So buckle up, because we're about to uncover secrets that have been buried under Mexico City for centuries. Let's start with the first shocking truth that will blow your mind. When we think of environmental engineering and sustainable agriculture, we usually picture modern technology: solar panels, hydroponic farms, smart irrigation systems. But the Aztecs were doing this 500 years ago, and in many ways, they were doing it better than we do today. Picture this. You're standing on the shores of Lake Texcoco in central Mexico, circa 1450. What you see before you isn't just a lake. It's the foundation of one of history's most ingenious urban planning projects. The Aztecs didn't just build on the water, they built with the water, creating an integrated ecosystem that supported over 300,000 people. Now, here's what fascinated me when I first learned about this. Modern Mexico City, built on the same location, is literally sinking because we drained the lake and ignored the Aztec engineering principles. We're talking about a 21st century city that's sinking up to 20 inches per year because we thought we knew better than the Aztecs. That's like building a skyscraper and then being surprised when the foundation you ignored starts cracking. The chinampas, or floating gardens, were pure genius. These weren't actually floating. They were artificial islands built by weaving together reeds and piling mud on top. But here's the brilliant part. They created a self-sustaining agricultural system that was essentially the world's first large-scale aquaponics operation. Let me give you a modern comparison that'll make this crystal clear. You know how today's most advanced vertical farms use nutrient-rich water to grow crops without soil? The Aztecs were doing this centuries ago, but better. Their chinampas produce 7 crops per year, not per season. Per year. To put that in perspective, even our most efficient modern farms typically produce 1 or 2 crops annually. The lake water provided natural irrigation. The decomposing vegetation created fertilizer. And the canals between chinampas allowed for transportation and fish farming simultaneously. It was a closed-loop system that would make today's permaculture experts jealous. But here's what really gets me. They understood something. We're just rediscovering now that cities should work with nature, not against it. While European cities of the same period were dumping sewage in their streets and drinking water, Tenochtitlan had a complex system of freshwater aqueducts, public toilets, and waste management that wouldn't look out of place in a modern metropolis. They built their entire city on wooden piles driven deep into the lake bed, essentially creating the world's first earthquake-resistant urban foundation. When the Spanish arrived, they were amazed that such a massive city could exist in the middle of a lake without sinking. The secret? The Aztecs understood weight distribution and flexible foundations centuries before modern engineering made these concepts mainstream. Here's a statistic that'll give you chills. Tenochtitlan was cleaner than London, Paris, or any European capital of the time. Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés himself wrote that the Aztec capital was more beautiful than anything in Spain. This wasn't just politeness. European cities were literally cesspools compared to Aztec urban planning. The second shocking truth is about education, and this one personally infuriates me because it shows how far we've actually regressed in some areas. The Aztecs had achieved something that we're still struggling with today: universal, mandatory education for all children, regardless of gender or social class. Think about that for a moment. In 1500, when European women couldn't read and only noble children received any education, Aztec girls and boys were attending state-funded schools where they learned mathematics, astronomy, history, arts, and practical skills. We're talking about a society that prioritized education 300 years before the first public school opened in America. But this wasn't just basic literacy. The Aztec education system was sophisticated and specialized. They had two main types of schools, the Telpachcali for commoners and the Calmecac for nobles. But here's the twist. Merit could move you between them. If you showed exceptional ability, regardless of your birth status, you could advance to higher education. Let me tell you about a guy named Tlacaelel, not a household name, but he should be. Born into a relatively modest family, he became one of the most powerful advisors in Aztec history purely through educational achievement. His story reads like an ancient version of From Rags to Riches, except it happened in a society where education was seen as the great equalizer. The curriculum was incredibly advanced. Students learned the Aztec writing system, yes. They had writing, despite what some history books claim, which was a complex combination of pictographs and phonetic elements. They studied astronomy so sophisticated that their calendar was more accurate than the one Europeans were using. They learned medicine, including surgical procedures that European doctors wouldn't attempt for another century. Here's what blew my mind when I researched this. Aztec medical students were performing successful cataract surgeries and setting complex bone fractures using techniques that weren't adopted in Europe until the 1600s. They had a pharmacological knowledge base of over 3 cereal plants, many of which are still used in modern medicine today. But the most shocking part, the emphasis on ethics and philosophy. Every student, regardless of their intended profession, received extensive training in ethics, civic responsibility, and what we'd now call emotional intelligence. They believed that technical skills without moral grounding created dangerous individuals. Compare this to our modern education debates about standardized testing, funding inequality, and whether schools should teach soft skills. The Aztecs solved these problems 500 years ago by making education a civic duty, funding it through their tribute system, and integrating practical skills with ethical development. The result? A society with near-universal literacy, advanced technical knowledge, and a shared cultural foundation that held together millions of people across diverse ethnic groups. When Spanish priests tried to destroy Aztec books, they weren't just burning paper. They were destroying one of history's most successful educational achievements. Now we need to talk about the elephant in the room: human sacrifice. This is the third shocking truth, and it's probably the most misunderstood aspect of Aztec civilization. I'm not here to defend or condemn, but to give you the complex reality that history often glosses over. First, let's be clear. Human sacrifice did happen, and it was significant. Archaeological evidence confirms this. But here's what shocked me during my research: the scale and purpose have been wildly exaggerated and misrepresented, often to justify Spanish colonization. Spanish chroniclers claimed that the Aztecs sacrificed 20 Suro people during a single ceremony. Modern archaeology suggests these numbers were inflated by 10 to 20 times. We're still talking about hundreds of people, which is horrific by our standards. But the Spanish were simultaneously burning people alive in the Inquisition and would later kill millions of indigenous people through warfare and disease. Here's the context that changes everything. To the Aztecs, sacrifice wasn't murder. It was the highest honor. They believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and keep the sun moving, so humans needed to reciprocate to maintain cosmic balance. It's like if your entire worldview was built around the idea that the universe would collapse unless certain rituals were performed. Let me share a story that illustrates this complexity. There's an account of an Aztec warrior named Tlacahuepan who was captured by enemies. Instead of trying to escape, he actually requested to be sacrificed because he believed it would elevate his status in the afterlife and protect his family. To us, this seems incomprehensible, but to him, it was a rational choice within his belief system. But here's where it gets really complex: the political dimension. Sacrifice wasn't just religious, it was psychological warfare. When tributary cities sent representatives to witness these ceremonies, they weren't just seeing a religious ritual, they were receiving a very clear message about what happened to enemies of the empire. It's similar to how modern nations display military power through parades or demonstrations. The Aztecs used religious ceremony to project political power, which is actually not that different from how religious and political authority have been intertwined throughout history. Here's what really shocked me. Recent archaeological evidence suggests that many sacrifice victims were actually volunteers or prisoners of war who had been ritually elevated to semi-divine status before their deaths. They were fed the finest foods, given luxury accommodations, and treated as living gods for weeks or months before the ceremony. This doesn't make it acceptable by our standards, but it reveals a society with a completely different understanding of death, honor, and cosmic responsibility. When Spanish conquistadors arrived and saw these rituals through their own cultural lens, they couldn't comprehend that this was a religious act, not sadistic entertainment. The real lesson here isn't about sacrifice, it's about how cultural narratives get constructed. The Spanish needed to portray the Aztecs as savage to justify their own actions. Similarly, we need to be careful about how we judge historical societies by modern standards without understanding their worldview. The fourth shocking truth completely changes how we understand the conquest. And this one really gets me fired up because it's been so misrepresented in popular history. The idea that a few hundred Spanish conquistadors overthrew a massive empire is not just wrong, it's actively harmful to understanding what actually happened. Here's the real story. When Hernán Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan in 1521, he wasn't leading 600 Spanish soldiers. He was commanding an army of over 100 Oro warriors, and the vast majority of them were indigenous peoples who had been subjugated by the Aztecs and wanted revenge. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about European superiority or superior technology. We're talking about a civil war where one side happened to have Spanish allies. Let me tell you about the Tlaxcalans, because their story changes everything. The Tlaxcalan city-state had been fighting the Aztecs for decades, locked in what historians call the Flower Wars, ritualized conflicts that served both military and religious purposes. When the Spanish arrived, the Tlaxcalans initially fought them too. But here's the crucial moment. After a series of battles, the Tlaxcalan leadership made a strategic decision. They realized that these strange newcomers with their metal weapons and horses might be the key to finally defeating their Aztec oppressors. So they formed an alliance. The numbers tell the real story. During the final siege of Tenochtitlan, Cortés had about 1,000 Spanish soldiers and over 100 indigenous allies. That's a ratio of 100 to 1. The Spanish provided some tactical advantages, horses, steel weapons, and different military strategies, but the manpower, local knowledge, and motivation came from indigenous groups who had their own reasons for wanting the Aztec Empire destroyed. This completely reframes the narrative. Instead of Europeans conquering primitives, we're looking at a complex political situation where the Aztecs had created so many enemies through their tributary system that they were vulnerable to a coalition revolt. The Spanish didn't conquer the Aztecs, they became the catalyst that allowed oppressed peoples to overthrow their oppressors. It's more like if a foreign power arrived during the American Civil War and one side recruited them as allies. What fascinates me about this is how it reveals the political sophistication of indigenous leaders. The Tlaxcalans, the Kempoalans, and other groups weren't naive people being manipulated by clever Europeans. They were experienced politicians making calculated decisions about how to advance their own interests. They understood exactly what they were doing, trading one set of overlords for another, but believing that the Spanish would be better than the Aztecs. Of course, history proved them tragically wrong, but their decision-making process was entirely rational given the information they had. This truth has huge implications for how we understand colonialism. It wasn't just external conquest, it was often the result of internal conflicts being exploited by outside forces. We see this pattern repeated throughout history. Divide and conquer works because divisions already exist. The lesson here is about the dangers of creating systems that generate too many enemies. The Aztec tribute system was so harsh that it created a coalition of opposition that eventually destroyed them. It's a cautionary tale about the sustainability of power based purely on force. The fifth and most devastating truth is one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The Aztec Empire wasn't primarily conquered by Spanish swords or horses. It was destroyed by invisible enemies that no warrior could fight epidemic diseases that killed 90% of the indigenous population within a century. This is the most tragic part of the story, and it's crucial to understand because it shows how the encounter between Old and New World was always going to be catastrophic, regardless of Spanish intentions or indigenous resistance. When the Spanish arrived, They brought with them diseases that had been circulating in European and Asian populations for thousands of years. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and plague. Europeans had developed some immunity through generations of exposure, but indigenous Americans had no biological defense against these pathogens. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates suggest that the indigenous population of central Mexico dropped from about 15 million in 1519 to 1 dying, 5 million by 1600. That's a 90% population decline in less than a century. To put that in perspective, imagine if the entire population of the United States was reduced to 33 million people in the next 80 years. Let me share a specific story that illustrates this tragedy. There's an account from a Spanish priest named Bartolomé de las Casas, who described arriving at a village that had been thriving just months earlier. He found empty houses, unburied bodies, and maybe a dozen survivors out of hundreds of residents. The priest wrote that the survivors were too weak to bury their dead, too traumatized to plant crops, and many were simply waiting to die. This scene was repeated thousands of times across the Americas. What makes this even more tragic is that it was largely unintentional. The Spanish didn't understand germ theory that wouldn't be discovered for another 300 years. They had no idea they were carrying biological weapons that would devastate entire civilizations. But here's what really gets me. Even if the Spanish had been completely peaceful traders instead of conquistadors, the result would have been largely the same. The first extended contact between these populations was always going to trigger a biological catastrophe. This is why the military conquest was possible at all. Imagine trying to defend your city when 70% of your population is dead or dying. Your agricultural system has collapsed because there aren't enough people to work the fields. And your government has broken down because most of your leaders are gone. The Spanish didn't conquer a healthy empire. They moved into the ruins of a civilization that had already been destroyed by disease. It's like showing up to a city after a nuclear disaster and claiming you conquered it. Here's something that blew my mind. Some historians argue that if the disease exchange had gone the other way, if Americans had diseases that Europeans couldn't resist, world history would be completely different. The technological and military advantages that we think made European conquest inevitable might not have mattered at all against biological warfare. This truth has obvious relevance to our recent pandemic experience. COVID-19 gave us a tiny taste of how quickly disease can disrupt society, economy, and government. Now imagine a disease 10 times more deadly affecting a population with zero immunity, and you begin to understand what happened to the Aztecs. The real lesson here is about biological vulnerability and the importance of global health security. In our interconnected world, we're all potentially vulnerable to the same kind of biological catastrophe that destroyed indigenous American civilizations. The lesson that changed everything. So what's the big takeaway from these 5 shocking truths about the Aztec Empire? The most important lesson isn't about the past. It's about how we understand complex civilizations and the dangers of oversimplified narratives. The Aztecs weren't primitive people who were inevitably conquered by superior Europeans. They were sophisticated engineers, educators, and political organizers who built one of history's most impressive urban civilizations. Their downfall came from a perfect storm of biological catastrophe, political instability, and strategic miscalculation. But here's why this matters today. We live in a world where we're quick to judge other cultures, dismiss other perspectives, and assume that our way of doing things is automatically better. The Aztec story shows us that civilizations rise and fall based on their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, not their inherent superiority or inferiority. The Aztecs created sustainable agriculture that could feed millions, universal education that promoted social mobility, and urban planning that worked with nature instead of against it. They also practiced human sacrifice and built an empire through military conquest. They were neither noble savages nor bloodthirsty primitives. They were complex people building a complex society, trying to solve the same fundamental problems we're still working on today: how to feed large populations, how to educate citizens, how to maintain order, and how to adapt when the world changes around you. The real tragedy isn't just that this civilization was destroyed, it's that we lost the opportunity to learn from their innovations and perhaps find different solutions to modern problems. So the next time you hear someone oversimplify history or dismiss an entire culture, remember the Aztecs. Remember that the truth is always more complex, more interesting, and more important than the simple story. What do you think? Have these truths changed how you see the Aztec Empire? What other historical narratives do you think need to be re-examined? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to the complexity of history, hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started on uncovering the real stories behind civilization's greatest mysteries.